Hello, historians. Today we are going to begin with a series of challenges that are meant to get you thinking about what transpired in America, particularly in New England, that transformed the colonists from British subjects to revolutionaries. See, at the time, Great Britain had the most powerful economy and the most powerful military, the Navy, in history. And so it's not as though a couple hundred American colonists woke up one day and thought, let's go to war with Great Britain, right? That's not exactly how it happened. There had to have been, over the course of time, a series of motivating factors. Now, if this were a 6th grade or an 8th grade or even a sophomore history class, you might be told that there was something special about America, right? That there was this unique kind of feel or mystique that was motivating these colonists to stand up for what they believed in and fight for independence, right? That might be what you've heard or what you would be learning if you were in sort of a lower level class. But as adults, we have to look at things beyond kind of the tropes or the magic or the kind of veneer that is presented to us. We have to look more specifically at what motivated these people, right? What transpired over the course of about 50 to 100 years that caused these colonists to go from wanting to earn favor with the royal crown to wanting to go to war with them for their own country. This is called a revolution because it's revolutionary. It is not run-of-the-mill. It's not something that happens on a regular basis. So you're going to be looking at this question, right? From colonies to revolution. What took America from the colonies to the revolution? And in order to do that, I want you to begin exploring a couple of forces or fields or themes that might have provided an impetus. So I'm going to share my screen with you and talk you through this, this particular challenge. And while I'm setting that up, go ahead and grab a blank piece of paper and a pen or a pencil so that you can follow along. All right. This challenge is called Colonial Society and the American Revolution, and it's a mind map challenge. Have you ever made a mind map? I'm not a big mind map person. I prefer outlines and paragraphs, and I'm a very linear thinker. That's why I typically use like white paper and black markers. I like artistic things, and I like to create art, but I don't necessarily organize information in an artistic way. But that's just me. That's just my way of organizing information. Each of you has to come up with your own methods for taking notes, for organizing information, for preparing research so that you can make sense of it. And that way it becomes part of your own brain's knowledge, right? See, there's one part of building knowledge that is the input of information. And then it's the processing that makes it content that you store in your brain. And you get to personalize how you do that. That's why these challenges can be sort of diverse in application. So instead of having you write a paper or instead of having you, create an outline, this particular challenge is going to encourage you to use your more visual artistic skills. Some of you, this is going to come super easy. Others, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. That's why it's called a challenge. It's fine. So as I talk through kind of what it is I'm asking you, I'm going to demonstrate for you how I approach a mind map. Your challenge is not to just regurgitate my mind map. My mind map is just one example of how to organize information, and that information will be important for you as you create your own mind map. But they're not the exact same. And by the end of today's lesson, you should understand what it is I'm asking you. So just keep following along, pause the recording if you need to, and it should become clear by the end of the lecture. So the Colonial Society and the American Revolution Mind Map Challenge. For this particular challenge, you're going to be creating your own mind map. And mind maps can be as creative or as linear as you want them to be. I used this as an example. You can see it's not specific to the challenge. It's just a visual representation of a mind map because I like the squares. I like the color coding, and I like the way it's organized. But just Google mind map and you'll notice that people have all kinds of interesting ways of organizing information, and you should be able to find something that you like too. So for this particular challenge, there are two reading lists that you might consider: Colonial America reading list and American Revolution reading list. Either of those reading lists can provide materials that will be useful for this challenge. I do not want you going beyond those reading lists. Don't Google, don't look up Wikipedia, use the resources in the actual class because that's the challenge, okay? So here's our prompt. By 1763, the outbreak of the revolution, Americans had never been more united. They fought and they celebrated together, but they also recognized that they were not considered full British citizens. They were considered something else. Americans across the colonies viewed imperial reforms as threats to the British liberties they saw as their birthright. And that's a direct quote from American Yacht. This week, you're going to be considering that question about unity, about colonial views on imperial reforms, and how that may have led to the outbreak of revolution. So you're going to explore those themes using the resources in the reading list in American Yacht, and you're going to create a mind map. Here's how. Here's your question. You might have thought that the American Revolution was motivated by a uniquely American identity and common beliefs shared by the colonists, as well as resistance to economic forces as a result of the French and Indian War. If you took a 7th grade American history class, you probably remember something called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act has often been used as like that final catalyst, shoved Americans in towards revolution. Well, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. The Stamp Act was probably a really significant moment, a watershed moment in American history, but it's not the only reason that America ends up going to war with Great Britain. Instead, as the reading recognizes, Americans evaluated the social, economic, and intellectual realities of colonialism alongside the political forces as they began to rebel. How did these social, economic, and intellectual forces lead the colonies toward revolution? That's your question. This is your question. How did social, economic, and intellectual forces lead the colonies toward revolution? And you're going to answer that question using materials from the reading list and interpreting it in a mind map. So before I send you off to do that, you're probably like, well, I don't know what you mean by social, economic, intellectual forces, right? Well, that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to actually draw you a mind map outlining what I mean by social, economic, and intellectual forces. It's then your job to try and identify how different sources within American Yacht align with those categories. Okay? So grab your pen and paper. We're going to do this together. I've started my mind map with the center, from colonies to revolution. The center or the title, you can kind of organize it. Like I said, Google mind maps, you'll find different ways to do this, but there should be some sort of identifier of either your central idea or theme, or for me, the topic, right? That's the topic of this particular lecture. And then I have a category for those three sources, those three categories: social, economic, intellectual, and then I have a little spot for political because we'll talk about that in a moment. So as a reminder, this is your prompt. By 1763, Americans had never been more united. They fought and they celebrated together, but they also recognized they weren't considered full British citizens. And they recognized this through a variety of ways, through social ways, economic ways, and intellectual ways. They also thought that some of the imperial reforms were becoming threats to their own British liberties, which they saw as their birthright. So your question is, though you may have thought that the American Revolution was motivated by a uniquely American identity and common beliefs shared among the colonists, as well as a resistance to economic forces resulting from the French and Indian War, the reading recognizes that Americans began to evaluate social, economic, and intellectual realities of colonialism as they began to rebel. So your question that you answer is, how did these social, economic, and intellectual forces lead the colonies toward revolution? So yes, the colonists were united in some ways. Basically, they had some shared experiences because they all lived in America. As a result, there was an evolution of some unique American identity aspects. They also had a shared resistance against the crown for forcing colonists to pay for the French and Indian War. Those two things are true. But there's additional things motivating these American colonists, right? They're not just motivated by those two things. They're not just special Americans who are resisting the crown. There's all these other things that are causing them to become revolutionary, to want freedom from Great Britain. So when I talk about social, economic, and intellectual forces, I'm looking to historians specifically to guide me in what it is I'm talking about. So social historians, there's also all kinds of different ways you can be a historian. Social historians focus on structures, they focus on interactions of different groups in society rather than affairs of government. You know how I said like there's a little spot for political up here? That's because political historians look at government structure, how is a government organized, and they look at laws and legislation. That's essentially what political historians look at. But social historians look at other stuff, right? It says here, as a field, they focus on middle and upper classes. They focus on economic history on one hand, but also sociology on the other. So you can see those bullets below in this PowerPoint, but I'm just going to write a few things under social here that I think are really significant to social historians. And I know it because I'm a social historian. So they're really interested in the organization of people. They're interested in relationships. And I'm just writing as I go. They're interested in consumption. Okay, so when I say consumption, I don't just mean products that people are buying, right? I don't just mean money that they're spending. I mean what people think those products say about them. Social historians are interested in the act and the actions of purchasing. So think about it. Are you an Apple person or an Android person? Do you like pineapple on your pizza or not? What does that say about you? What do you think that says about you, right? Do you like Nike or Adidas? Those kinds of questions may or may not matter, but social historians are curious about how Americans thought those kinds of things mattered. We're really interested in race, gender, and sexuality when we look over history, and we're very interested in the roles of non-white men. We want to know about experiences of people, the lived experiences. So I put that in brackets because I think that's important. So basically, social historians are interested in people and society. And I'm going to write that like social equals people and society, and I circled it. Do you see how I'm kind of starting to make like a little bit of a mind map here? Again, it's still pretty linear because that's the way I think. Some of you might be a way more abstract with what you're making, and that's great. What about economic historians? What are they interested in? Economic historians those are the people who research things like equality, finance, technology, labor, and business. They emphasize historicizing the economy itself. So they're really interested in trends in like Wall Street, right? How the stock market shifts according to different political or historical events. They're very interested in the way money is structured and conceived. So in general, they're also curious about the distribution of wealth, whereas social historians are interested in the distribution of wealth, but into categorizations of people, classes of people. Economic historians might be more interested in just like the distribution of wealth as it existed, right? When economic historians, for example, look at slavery, they're interested in the personal lived experiences of slaves, but they're also really curious about slavery as an empire or an industry. The evolution of wealth as a result of slavery. They're curious about taxes, and they're curious about things like land ownership. Do you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about how part of the reason that people from Great Britain decided to move to America was because they didn't have access to land ownership in Great Britain, but they could purchase and own land in America? Well, that's a great example of an economic historical statement. That's something an economic historian would look at. So an economic historian is interested in money and power, not for themselves, but researching it. So just like I did, I put social is power or people in society. Economic, I did a little circle, money and power. And then again, I put my little bullet points. And remember, you can pause the recording if you need to. All right, let's talk about intellectual. What are intellectual historians into? So intellectual historians, of course, debate constantly about what it is that they think about, what it is they talk about, but they're really interested in ideas, right? Thoughts, the evolution of ideas, the evolution of thoughts. So these are the people, when we're looking at this particular time in history, they're looking at like revolutionary writings and speeches. So whereas I, as a social historian, might be really interested in all the, hundreds of people that went to Patrick Henry's, speech, I'd be curious about the crowd, right? Intellectual historians are curious about the speech itself, the words themselves, okay? They're very into the famous writings of the revolution, like the Declaration of Independence, or Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, if you were in this class 20 years ago, you may have learned that all the American colonists read this piece called Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and that's what made them revolutionaries. That may have been a statement you might have learned in a history class 20 or so years ago. That's because intellectual historians were very persuasive in convincing historians that, general historians, that common sense, this one pamphlet written by this one revolutionary, made all the difference in the world. And maybe it did, but you don't have to believe that, right? You're a historian too. You don't have to say, common sense is the one impetus that got Americans towards revolution. You don't have to say the Stamp Act is the one impetus, right? You're looking at all three of these things. What were some social factors? What were some economic factors? And what were some intellectual factors? So I put right here, like famous writings, Common Sense, and the Declaration of Independence. They're curious around like the thinking, the rhetoric, like how are people talking about freedom and liberty, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, I might be interested as a social historian about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as it pertains to some farmer's wife in Pennsylvania. What did she think of that? How did she see that? Intellectual historians might be more interested in the evolution of that thought itself. What made people think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So they're really into thinking, writing, speaking, the stuff that people were saying about revolution. Thinking, writing, saying, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So does that make sense? So intellectuals are into ideas. Economic historians are into money and power. Social historians are into society and people. Your job now is to categorize some of the information available to you on American Yacht into a mind map that shows me that you understand what a social force might be, what an economic force might be, and what an intellectual force might be that caused Americans towards revolution. So here's a reminder of your challenge today. Review the assigned secondary sources and primary sources. Now remember, a primary source is a firsthand account, somebody who was there at the time, okay? I'm going to show you where to find those on the American Yacht, but a primary source is a firsthand account, someone who was there at the time, somebody who wrote or drew or did something that remains from the 1760s. A secondary source is a historian's analysis of sources. You need 5 primary sources, and you are creating one today. You're creating a secondary source. And in order to do that, you need 5 primary sources, okay? Then you're going to post in the discussion board some sort of mind map or timeline that identifies. You have to include a visual representation. PDF is fine, PowerPoint is fine, and image is fine. You have to identify those 5 primary sources you chose. Titles and authors are fine. I know all the primary sources available on the American Yup. So if you just put the title or the author, I'm going to know what you're talking about. If you go rogue and you go off into Google Images or Wikipedia, I'm not going to know what you're talking about, and you're not going to earn the full credit. You're going to need an explanation for how these sources or perspectives are connected and help you answer that question. You need to show me. If you pick 5 sources, and I'm asking for 3 categories, social, economic, and intellectual forces leading to the American Revolution, you have to show me, where do those 5 sources fit? And they don't all have to be the same. You could have 2 social, 2 intellectual, 1 economic. You could say all of these sources prove economic, right? It's up to you. That's the point. You're the historian. And I need you to cite your resources. Now, if you have all of your titles and authors correctly identified, I'm going to be in good shape. But if you don't clearly identify those sources, I need that work cited so I know what you're talking about, because otherwise you're just kind of going willy-nilly on me here. So a couple of hints: you're creating a mind map. Remember that that is a visual representation connecting ideas. You'll create some sort of central question or issue. And our central question is, how did social, economic, and intellectual forces lead the colonies toward revolution? You can make your mind map as complicated or as simple as you want. Mind maps can be a variety of things. You can do what I did. You can draw on a piece of paper and take a picture with your phone and upload it. Or there are free mind mapping tools that you can find online, and students have used both. Remember the difference between a primary and secondary source. And where do you get all the information? It's in the American Yup. So before I let you go, here's your assignment that we're talking about. These are your useful resources. You can go to reading list 5 or reading list 6. Here's that link in reading list 5 directly to American Yup. Here's the link to primary sources in reading list 6. The American Revolution, look at this. 9 primary sources right here. You need 5. You could just pick 5 from this list. Same with the Colonial Society one. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Again, 9 primary sources at the bottom of this paragraph or this page. So all you need are 5. You have 18 to choose from. Don't go to Wikipedia. Don't go to Google. Just use these. Click on any one of these. Let's say we're going to look at the American Revolution option. Let's say I'm really curious about Abigail and John Adams' letters on women's rights in 1776. Do I think this is a social source, an economic source, a political source, or an intellectual source? Or is it a little bit of both or multiples, right? However, that's the point of a mind map. You can draw connections however you want to, and then just share it with me in the discussion board. All right. I wish you all the best. Remember, you're the historian. Don't go looking for the answers. No, someone else isn't going to tell you the answers. Your job is to look at these primary sources and make a claim. Just try, see what you think. All right, everybody, enjoy.